Ukraine has done such a vastly better job at total mobilization than has Russia. In other words, recruiting, training, equipping, organizing, and employing additional forces and capabilities, aided enormously, again, by the arsenals of democracy, which has made this possible. But they have done, again, obviously the really, really hard work, and not to mention just the fighting and casualties and so forth. But they now have a larger and more capable military in Ukraine than do the Russians, which is astonishing given that Russia is more than 3 times of Ukraine, and also that Russia has incredible advantages when it comes to energy, minerals, and other commodities. There's second reality is that there's nothing Russia can do about this. The partial mobilization, they'll provide additional fighters. They're frankly going to be cannon fodder in large measure. They're not well trained or equipped or even all that fit. They will cause problems. They can, especially in urban settings, they can be a challenge, but they're not the kind of combat capability that Ukraine is increasingly bringing into the field as they go through real training programs and equipping and all the rest of this enabled by the US and the West. What Russia can do, however, is punish Ukraine. And I've said this even before the Kerch Strait Bridge explosion, which brought about enormous use of missiles, drone swarms, and so forth from land, sea, and air, just hammering not military targets in Ukraine per se, but increasingly civilian infrastructure, especially energy generation, transmission, and water systems. This is a counter value, if you will, rather than counter force, to use that description, trying to break the will of Ukrainian people, but actually galvanizing even greater resolve at the same time that Russia is trying to break the will of the Europeans with the lack of natural gas going through Nord Stream 1 and 2 and other restrictions, which is not working. In fact, I've been in Europe 3 times in the last 5 weeks, and they're at over 92% fill of the capacity for natural gas storage. There are LNG carriers actually parked off the coast, waiting for additional capacity to open up, and the winter has been quite mild so far. So the prospects, touch wood, are that unless there's a really extreme sustained period of cold weather, that the Europeans will get through this without enormous rationing or other restrictions. In fact, the spot price of, not the futures price, but the spot price of natural gas last week when I was in London briefly went below zero. In other words, you were paying them to take it rather than the other way around, as we saw in crude oil a few years ago. The futures price still very elevated, still problematic, still going to cause probably real problems for industries in particular that use natural gas as a raw material. But they're not going to outsuffer the Europeans or the Ukrainians the way Putin thought they might, given that Russia has outsuffered the Nazis and Napoleon and others over the years. So the prospect is that Ukraine will continue to be on the receiving end of a degree of punishment, though additional air defense and ballistic missile defense systems are going in, 2 important ones that we're sending later this week or early next week, and the continued arms, ammunition, material that we're providing that are really enabling Ukraine, in particular, to push Russian headquarters, logistics stocks, assembly areas, and so forth, 70 kilometers from the front lines, because that's the range of the precision guided missile launch rocket munition, Gimler's round, you could put it in a dining room table at that distance. So that's where we are. The Ukrainians are now determined to achieve Ukraine whole and free, which they define, I asked them recently, as including Crimea and that portion of the Donbass controlled by the Russian-supported separatists. Whether that's realistic or not, it is certainly in question. But at some point, not now, because neither side is inclined to negotiate, at some point, perhaps after much more tough fighting, tough casualties, further liberation of Ukrainian soil from that areas occupied by Russia since the invasion, at some point, there's going to have to be some kind of grand bargain, which has elements in it of, again, US with EU, UK, everything together with Ukraine. Again, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, as the administration says rightly, and talking about how they can extricate Russian forces who have suffered at least 4 times, I think, the losses in 8 months that they sustained in 9 years of tough fighting in Afghanistan, get out from underneath the financial, economic, personal sanctions and export controls. Ukraine stopped being punished, and perhaps we announce or hold out the prospect for some kind of Marshall Plan together again with EU, UK, Japan, others, and some kind of durable security guarantee, which will be necessary, and without which a Marshall Plan cannot truly succeed. Harkening back to the original Marshall Plan, the success of which was not necessarily the amount of money provided to the really destroyed European nations in the wake of World War II. It was the security guarantee that the United States provided. All of that, I think, put together at some point, but neither side right now, neither Putin nor President Zelensky can go to the negotiating table and is inclined to do that. It's going to take much more tough fighting and tough casualties.
So we are in for a long, hard winter for them.
I fear, yes, but it'll be a winter that on the battlefield is much tougher for the Russians than it is, I think, for the Ukrainians, who will be fighting on their own soil, fighting for their survival. This is their war of independence, really.
Absolutely.
And they approach it. There was a particular Ukrainian commander that came out of Ukraine to meet with retired Lieutenant General Hodges, someone had multiple combat tours together, and me during the Warsaw Security Forum. And he said, we'll fight them in our underwear this winter if we have to. They won't have to, because they've got good kit being provided again, not just by their own military industry, but by the West as well. The lessons of Ukraine, I guess we hope, are that these kind of operations are really, really hard. And a 100-mile amphibious operation would be incredibly challenging, especially if that country has really mobilized the way that Ukraine has. And there's a lot of activity that needs to take place in that regard. Look, at the end of the day, obviously what we want to do is absolutely deter any conflict, and to, at some point down the road, again, get a degree of convergence that has been missing at current times. The idea being that, you cooperate where you can and you compete where you must. But instead, this has evolved into, again, what Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, has described as severe competition. That's a very significant term.
It sure is. It sure is.
Understated, very thoughtful, very bright, but understated guy. That's quite a statement. And it is, it's clarifying, if you will. No one was more critical of the current administration on the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and the way in which it was done, frankly, than I was. In this case, I think you have to give considerable credit to the U.S. administration, which I think has done a very impressive job, even before the war, of taking finished intelligence products and then, if you will, laundering them so they could be released publicly as statements without exposing sources and methods. That's not as easy as it sounds, and I think they did a very impressive job in that, so that they established real credibility when everything they said was going to happen actually did happen, even though many in Europe and even to a degree in Kyiv did not want necessarily to accept that. So then the enormous support that we have provided, really leading the world and guiding the world, $18.5 billion in arms, ammunition, and material alone, another 13 plus billion of economic assistance, again, guiding, galvanizing, encouraging that by our EU, UK, and other Western allies and partners around the world, leading with the coordinating the imposition of financial, economic, and personal sanctions, as well as export controls, and continuing to tighten those, to add to those, and so forth. I think all of this has been very, very important.